Now we're going to work on problems 11 and 14 from the chapter 13 review. So these are graphing the cosine function. So the 11 is -3 cosine 4 theta. So we are graphing without any kind of transformations. And then number 14 is -3 cosine 4 theta, but then it has a phase shift and a vertical shift that we're going to identify and use. So let's look at number 11. So if we want to find the period and amplitude, we're taking the values for A, which in this case is -3. So -3's absolute value is 3. So the amplitude of this is 3. And then the B value helps us find the period of the function. So the B is 4. And to find the period of cosine, we're still using 2 pi because sine and cosine have a general period of 2 pi, and dividing that by 4. So if we divide 2 pi by 4, that gives us, if we simplify, pi over 2. So the period of this is pi over 2. Remember, that means that this is going to be that last value. Since we're going up to 3, down to 3, the given graph is fine. So we need to figure out what we're going to label our axis with using the period. So remember that there are 4 marks that we're going to label. So we've labeled the 4th one. We need to figure out the other 3. To do that, we need to divide this into quarters. So when it's a fraction, it's best to think about it as doing half of the period, 1/4 of the period. So I'm going to do 1/4 times the pi over 2 to identify what that interval is going to be on the x-axis. So 1/4 times pi over 2 is going to give us pi over 8. So remember, that means that the first point here is pi over 8. To get the subsequent points, this isn't as easy as the sine one because it's fractions. I actually have to add pi over 8. When I do that, I get 2 pi over 8. When I add it again, I get 3 pi over 8. And then when I add it one last time, I get 4 pi over 8. Okay, so I'm adding pi over 8 3 times. Notice it's just 1 pi over 8, 2 pi over 8, 3 pi over 8, 4 pi over 8. I want to simplify anything that I can. So since I have 2 and 8 are both even, I actually want to write this as pi over 4 on my x-axis. And then 3 pi over 8, I can't simplify. And then this should be pi over 2 because that's the end of the cycle. I already have it labeled, and so we can notice that 4 goes into 8 twice, so that becomes pi over 2. Okay, so we're done with our x-axis. And so now what we have left to do is to graph it for 2 full cycles. So remember that one cycle, a cosine graph, is A0, negative A, 0, A for our y values. So since A is -3, that means I'm starting at -3 on my y-axis. The next point's at 0. Negative A, or the opposite of A, is going to be +3, 0, then -3. So my one cycle is those 5 points, -3, 0, 3, 0, -3 for my y coordinates on the x values that I labeled. Okay, so let's kind of draw in our cosine curve. So to repeat the second cycle, right, we graphed it for 1 cycle. We need to graph it for 2 cycles. We are just following through the process. So if I'm starting on the y-axis, I'm going backwards because I'm moving that direction. Okay, so if this is my A, the next one is this 0, then negative A, then 0, then A. So the graph will look like so. So that is 2 cycles of -3 cosine 4 theta. So we're done with question 11. If we look at question 14, A and B again are the same, but these now have H and K. So the H value in this one is what's inside the parentheses. Remember, it's minus H, so it's always the opposite. So this is negative pi over 2 is the value for H. H tells us a phase shift, so that means that negative is left. So this is going left pi over 2 units. And then our K value here is -2. Since it's negative, that means we're going down 2 units. Okay, so we've identified the vertical and phase shift. What we want to do next is essentially copy our graph from the problem before, right? So we're going to do the parent function as a dotted line and label our axis as before. Okay, so let's look at what our axis was. It was pi over 8, pi over 4, 3 pi over 8, pi over 2. Actually, I'm going to change this problem just so that it isn't a bad translation. So I'm sorry about this, but we're going to change this to, instead of it being pi over 2, we're going to change this to a pi over 4. And just because I don't want to, it's not going to be a good visual or good practice for you if it's all the way over there. So if I make this a pi over 4 instead, then h is negative pi over 4, and we're going to translate left pi over 4 units. On our x-axis, pi over 4 is, if you look at that, 4 boxes. The reason that I changed it from the pi over 2 is pi over 2 is 8 whole boxes, and that'll get it'll essentially look exactly the same. So I want to make sure that you can see what's going on. So our parent function is this right-hand side of this graph. So let's plot those 5 points again on here so that we have something to move. So this is just our graph from the previous problem, only one cycle, and we're going to move every point down to left pi over 4. So since I'm moving left, I'm going to start on the left. So with the first point, I'm going to move down 2, which is a little bit off my graph, and then left pi over 4, which again, we said was 4 boxes. So 4 boxes means all the way to here. So this first point moves there. The next point down 2, left pi over 4, which is 4 boxes. The next point left down 2, left pi over 4. So we did that one. The next point down 2, left pi over 4 is 4 boxes. And then the last one down 2, left pi over 4. So that gives me this shape for my translation. So we can visually see that it moved down to left pi over 4. It might be a good idea to kind of draw it out so that you can visualize that to make sure that it's good before you copy out the 2 cycles. Okay, so then remember that we can draw the line with the highlighter through that value, -2, to kind of see where the x-axis moved, and that'll help you do the pattern on the missing sides, or at least it helps me. So that means that on this line will be next because I'm below here, so it's going to be on the line, and then over 2, it's going to be up 3 because the amplitude is 3. So I can see the amplitude there and kind of finish out the pattern. So then here I know I'm going to go over 2, and then it's on the line, over 2, and this one has to be an up because it always has an up and a down again. So then that graph there is the graph of -3 cosine 4 times the quantity theta plus pi over 4 minus 2. So again, I changed that a little bit from what it was on the review. So we'll do the tangent one in the next video.